Explore mythology through academic scholarship. We analyze primary sources, archaeology, and scholarly interpretations. No romantic fiction, just rigorous historical and literary analysis. Subscribe now for academic deep dives into myths from every culture that shaped human civilization.
The figure of Tiresias, Greek Tiresias, Latin Tiresias, does not originate from a single unified myth, but from a collection of Theban-centric and pan-Hellenic narrative traditions fixed in various genres and Latin poetry of the imperial age, Ovid. The following reconstruction does not harmonize the variants. It exposes them, organizes them thematically and chronologically, and notes when a source offers an alternative version. Tiresias is remembered as the quintessential seer of Thebes, a Boeotian city with a rich mythical memory. The dynasty of Cadmus and Harmony, internal conflicts of the royal house, and political crises interpreted as religious crises. His figure spans multiple generations, as if the city retained a stable prophetic consciousness within him. His voice returns whenever power must confront a limit imposed by the divine. As a young man, Tiresias is already situated in a boundary zone between the human and the divine, for his blindness is not presented as a common accident. It is the mark of a fracture related to improper contact with the sacred and, simultaneously, the origin of his prophetic competence. The traditions regarding how he lost his sight do not coincide, but agree on one structure, an irretrievable loss and a compensatory gift that renders him capable of saying what others cannot bear to sustain. The narration of the myth of Tiresias according to 9 sources, from the most remote to the most recent.
Homer, archaic epic tradition, 8th through 7th century BC, depicts Tiresias in the Odyssey, an epic poem in hexameters, oral performance, introducing him in Book 11, during the Nicaea, as a dead man who retains intellect and prophetic ability, guiding Odysseus with instructions and prophecies about his return and ultimate fate. Homer, 8th through 7th century BC, Odyssey 11. In Homeric epic, Tiresias is not introduced with a Theban biography, no origins, snakes, Athena, Zeus, and Hera. He enters directly as a prophetic authority in the underworld. Odysseus, having left the island of Circe, receives the order to perform a rite of invoking the dead, a Nicaea, for only Tiresias can indicate to him the way back and the means to placate Poseidon's wrath. Odysseus reaches a boundary place with Hades and prepares the ritual. He digs a pit and performs libations, then immolates victims and lets their blood flow. The shadows of the deceased rush en masse toward the blood, and Odysseus must hold them back with his sword, imposing a sacred order on the scene, for Tiresias must be the first to drink. When Tiresias approaches and drinks, he does not appear confused like many shadows. He retains consciousness and speech. He interrogates Odysseus and then pronounces instructions that bind together guilt, offended divinity, and fate. Poseidon pursues him for the blinding of Polyphemus. The return depends on how Odysseus and his men can withstand trials and transgressions, and beyond the return there lies a future duty, a journey into the inland, carrying an oar until someone mistakes it for a paddle, with reparative sacrifices to reconcile the hero with the god of the sea. Tiresias here is thus a dead man who sees more than the living, and his story is entirely contained in his role as a post-mortem prophet.
Sophocles of Colonus, an Athenian tragedian of the classical age, represented at the Great Dionysia, a civic religious festival of Dionysus, audience, public theater, stages Tiresias as an authority contested by power. In Oedipus Rex, the prophecy identifies the sovereign as the cause of the contamination. In Antigone, Tiresias interprets the divine refusal of sacrifices due to the denied burial and warns Creon, announcing domestic mourning. 2. Sophocles, 5th century BC, Oedipus Rex. In Sophocles, Tiresias is already an established seer in Thebes, elderly and blind, called as a civic resource in an emergency situation. The city is devastated by a crisis shaped like a plague or sterility, and is interpreted religiously. There is a contamination, miasma, weighing on the polis, because the murder of the previous king, Laius, has not been avenged. Oedipus, the current sovereign, summons Tiresias to reveal the identity of the murderer. Tiresias resists. His reticence is not ignorance, but awareness that the truth will destroy both the listener and the speaker. When he speaks, he reveals the unsustainable. The pollution of the city does not come from an external other, but from the king himself. Oedipus is the murderer of Laius. Oedipus reacts by politicizing the prophecy. He suspects a palace conspiracy and accuses Tiresias of corruption or being manipulated by Creon. Tiresias responds by claiming an authority that does not depend on human favor, but on the god. In the drama, the framework is Apollonian, and constructs a moral reversal of blindness. He does not see with his eyes, but knows. Oedipus sees, yet is blind to his identity. From here, Tiresias exits the scene, but his word remains as an axis that forces the tragedy to unfold. Oedipus's quest confirms step by step the oracle's response and leads to family catastrophe.
3. Sophocles, 5th century BC, Antigone. Here, Tiresias intervenes in another Theban crisis following the fratricidal war between Eteocles and Pousanias. Creon governs and forbids the burial of Pousanias. The prohibition creates a conflict between the law of the city and religious obligations towards the dead, as leaving a corpse unburied exposes the community to impurity and divine offense. Tiresias enters bringing negative signs derived from sacrifices and omens. The rites do not work, the omens are impure, and the order among gods, city, and the dead is broken. He interprets the cause. The denial of burial has contaminated the sacred sphere, and the gods refuse the offering until the act is repaired. Creon reacts as Oedipus did. He accuses Tiresias of self-interest and manipulation. Tiresias then pronounces a warning that sounds like a condemnation. The punishment will strike the house of the king. Creon yields, but too late. The drama shows that correction, arriving too late, does not prevent the series of deaths that follow. In this tragedy, Tiresias is the threshold between religious sign and political decision, and his story coincides with his role as the last, unheeded corrective in time.
Euripides, about 485 to 406 BC, an Athenian tragedian in Bacchae, tragedy performed posthumously in 405 BC, presents Tiresias as an old man who recognizes Dionysus and attempts to dissuade the king from denying the cult. In Phoenician Women, tragedy from the late 5th century BC, he provides a response that ties the salvation of Thebes to an extreme sacrifice, shifting Tiresias into the realm of the price of religious civic survival. 4. Euripides, 5th century BC, Bacchae. In Bacchae, Tiresias appears in an unusual role compared to Sophocles, not as an isolated opponent of power, but as an elder who, alongside Cadmus, recognizes the divinity of Dionysus and supports the adoption of his cult. Dionysus has returned to Thebes to claim honors and rights, and the city is traversed by a conflict between the acknowledgement of the god and political repression. Tiresias and Cadmus prepare to participate in the Dionysian rites despite their age, a gesture that theatrically affirms that the god must be welcomed and that the city cannot treat him as a human phenomenon to be disciplined. Pentheus, the king of Thebes, ridicules the elders and treats the cult as moral disorder and civil threat. Tiresias attempts to dissuade him. His authority here is primarily religious and prudent, for he sees that denying Dionysus does not eliminate the god, but makes him vengeful. The drama continues toward the punishment of Pentheus, overwhelmed by the Dionysiac power and ultimately destroyed, while Tiresias remains as a figure who had seen the necessity of acknowledgement.
Euripides, 5th century BC, Phoenician Women. In Phoenician Women, Tiresias again serves as a consultant for the city amid a military and dynastic crisis, the war between Eteocles and Polynices, and the looming threat over Thebes. Here, divination serves not only to unmask a guilty party, but to enunciate conditions for salvation that entail a human cost. Tiresias pronounces a response that links the survival of the polis to an extreme sacrifice. The city can save itself only if a young man from Creon's house, Menicius, offers his own life. The text stages the impact of the response, the conflict between civic duty and familial bond, and the young man's decision to accept the imposed fate as a collective price. In this context, Tiresias is not so much the antagonist of the king as a voice of a sacred necessity that politics cannot circumvent. His Euripidean story, therefore, coincides with the proclamation and triggering of an irreversible act that saves the city while deepening the wound of the ruling house.
Callimachus of Cyrene, circa 310 to 240 BC, poet and philologist of the Hellenistic period, active in Alexandria within the system of the museum and library, composes the hymns, a learned and elusive poetry intended for an erudite audience. In the Hymn to Athena, genre literary hymn, date 3rd century BC, performance learned reading or recitation, he places the blindness of Tiresias within the episode of the forbidden gaze at the goddess's bath and the supplication of his mother, Chariclo, structuring the logic of irrevocable punishment plus prophetic compensation. 6. Callimachus of Cyrene, 3rd century BC, Hymn to Athena. In Callimachus, the story of Tiresias is primarily an origin story, why he is blind and why he is a prophet. Tiresias, as a young man, enters the space of Athena's bath, who is washing herself by a spring with the nymphs. The episode is constructed as a violation of the gaze. The goddess's nudity is not an object of human desire, but a reality that should not be seen by a mortal. Tiresias sees the goddess, and the punishment is immediate. Athena deprives him of sight. At this point, the narrative insists on the mother, Chariclo, who pleads with Athena. The pain is not abstract, but familial and personal. The goddess does not revoke the act. The divine order is not rescinded, but grants a compensation. She gives Tiresias divination, transforming the loss into a function. The Callimachean trajectory thus closes with a founding paradox. Tiresias loses his sight because he sees too much, and becomes a seer precisely because he no longer sees like others.
Ovid, Publius Ovidius Naso, 43 B.C. to 1718 A.D., a Roman poet of the Augustan age, in the Metamorphoses, poem in hexameters, completed circa A.D. 8, intended for clotured Roman readers, narrates the variant involving snakes, sex change, and the dispute between Zeus and Hera, culminating in blindness inflicted by Hera and a prophetic gift granted by Zeus. The insertion occurs within the Theban cycle of Book 3, thus serving as a link and anticipation of Theban-centric events. Seventhly, Ovid, 1st century B.C. to 1st century A.D., Metamorphoses III. In Ovid, Tiresias receives a metamorphic biography that explains both his blindness and his prophetic authority. The story begins with Tiresias encountering two paired snakes. He strikes them and, as an immediate effect, changes sex, becoming a woman. He lives for years in a female condition, then a second similar encounter with the snakes and a corresponding action restores him to being a man.
This experience made him the only possible witness to resolve a dispute that arose between Zeus and Hera. The two sovereigns of Olympus were jokingly debating which sex experienced greater pleasure during lovemaking. Zeus maintained it was the woman, Hera the man. Tiresias, consulted as an expert of both worlds, confirmed Zeus's thesis, stating that if pleasure were divided into 10 parts, 9 would belong to the woman. Hera, offended by the revelation of a secret she considered humiliating for her sex, punished him with eternal blindness. Zeus, to mitigate the misfortune, granted him knowledge of the future and an extremely long life, extended over 7 human generations.
In the sequence of Book 3, Tiresias's prophetic authority also serves a narrative function. His prophetic authority becomes a tool to anticipate other events within the Theban material, showing how the seer is activated by metamorphosis, divine conflict, and punishment.
Pseudo-Apollodorus, 1st to 2nd century A.D., author of the Bibliotheca, prosaic mythographic compilation, performance, learned reading, tends to systematize genealogies and variants, recording Tiresias as a recurring node within Theban traditions and compactly preserving etiological motives, snakes, divine dispute, and narrative functions, advice or warnings in crises. Pseudo-Apollodorus, 1st to 2nd century A.D., Bibliotheca, In the mythographic Bibliotheca, Tiresias appears as a systematized figure. He is not dramatized as in tragedy, nor adorned as in erudite poetry, but inserted into a network of genealogies and variants. The text tends to compactly record the etiological tradition of blindness and the prophetic gift, particularly the line Zeus, Hera, connected to Tiresias as an arbitrator after the experience of gender change, while also placing him as a recurring seer in the Theban saga. The story of Tiresias here is thus a function-based biography, an origin, punishment plus compensation, and a series of re-emergences as an authoritative consultant during significant crises in Thebes. The overall effect is that of a Tiresias archive, useful for connecting episodes scattered across different works.
Pausanias, 2nd century A.D., in his description of Greece, pariegetic prose, intended audience, cultured Greco-Roman readers, testifies to the topographic dimension of mythic memory. Figures such as Tiresias can be anchored to places, burials, monuments, and local Boeotian tales, showing the cultic and identity persistence of tradition. 9. Pausanias, 2nd century A.D., description of Greece. In Pausanias, Tiresias primarily enters as local and topographical memory, not as a stage character. The story takes shape as a memory anchored to places, traditions that the Greeks of the time associate with Thebes and Boeotia, tales connected to monuments, burials, sanctuaries, and signs of the landscape. When Pausanias mentions mythic figures in local contexts, his way of narrating tends to be that of a witness reporting what is shown to him, rather than that of a poet recreating dialogues and conflicts. Tiresias, in this frame, becomes a presence that the city can indicate, part of a heritage of memory that continues to live in space.
Academic analysis of the myth Tiresias. This analysis interprets the mythic literary profile reconstructed before, now using only academic secondary bibliography, university monographs, peer-reviewed articles, specialized handbooks. I treat Tiresias as a figure function that traverses genres, epic, tragedy, Hellenistic poetry, mythography, and periegesis, and that concentrates some of the most discussed theoretical problems in studies of Greek religion and tragedy. Authority of divination, relationship between polis and divine, impurity, gender and transformation, epistemology of seeing and not seeing, and cultural memory.
Origins and historical religious context. Within the studies of Greek religion, divination is not understood as marginal irrationality, but as a cultural technology for decision-making in conditions of uncertainty. Walter Burkert, University of Zurich, later Harvard, active primarily 1960 to 2000, specialist in comparative Greek religion and ritual, insisted that communication with the divine in Greece occurs through codified practices, sacrifice, signs, oracles that have full social legitimacy, even when they produce political conflict. Burkert, Greek Religion, 1985. Within this framework, Tiresias is a mobile institution, not a priest of a sanctuary, but an itinerant or urban expert capable of translating signs into decisions.
A particularly influential arrangement of the seer figure in Greece is that of Michael Flower, Princeton University, active 1990 to present, specialist in divination and Greek cultural history, who distinguishes between charismatic authority and technical competence, showing how seers can be consulted, contested, and even accused of mercenary practices without undermining the system of divination. Flower, The Seer in Ancient Greece, 2008. The contestability of Tiresias in tragedies, accusations of corruption, conspiracy suspicions, thus corresponds to a structural datum. Divination is authoritative, but must be negotiated in an agonistic environment like the polis.
The theme of impurity has been classically analyzed by Robert Parker, University of Oxford, active 1970 to present, specialist in Greek religion and ritual, as a religious category with social and legal consequences. It is not moral guilt in a modern sense, but contamination that alters the relationships between the community and divinity, requiring procedures for repair. Parker, Miasma, Pollution and Purification in Early Greek Religion, 1983. Tiresias, in the Theban-centric dramas, often operates as a diagnostician of this contamination. His knowledge is necessary because the city cannot self-define its own purity without an interpreter of the sacred.
Tiresias as a problem of knowledge, blindness, vision, truth. Much of the scholarship on Tiresias treats him as an epistemological device. His physical blindness becomes a figure of knowledge that does not coincide with ordinary perception. In the structural reading of tragedy proposed by Jean-Pierre Vernant and Pierre Vidal-Naquet, the tragic knowledge is not information, but a force that disarticulates identity and civic order. The scene of the seer speaking against the sovereign stages the conflict between two regimes of truth. Vernant and Vidal-Naquet, Myth and Tragedy in Ancient Greece, 1981. Tiresias embodies a truth that does not persuade with evidence, but with the authority of the divine sign, and it is precisely this that produces political resistance. The dialectic of seeing and not seeing has often been discussed in relation to more general models of negative knowledge in Greek culture. While not a classicist, the category of insight that arises from deprivation has inspired interdisciplinary readings. However, in strictly classical domains, studies on the history of disability and body have insisted that disability is not merely metaphorical, but a social signal. It produces dependency, the guide, authority, the exception, and ambivalence, respect and suspicion. Martha L. Rose, historian of the ancient world and disability, active 1990 to present, teaches in the USA, has shown how physical disabilities in Greece and Rome are often narrativized as marks of fate, competence, or punishment, and how this influences character construction. Rose works on disability in the Greco-Roman world. In Tiresias, authority arises precisely from the fact that loss is interpreted as contact with the divine.
Gender, metamorphosis, and liminality. The episode of sex change, in the Latin tradition and in many mythographic reconstructions, has attracted increasing attention in gender and queer classic studies, as Tiresias becomes a rare mythic point where gender experience is narrated as transition and not as essence. A central reference for gender performativity theory is Judith Butler, UC Berkeley,
active 1980 to present, political philosophy and gender theory. Although she does not specifically work on Tiresias, her conceptual framework has been used by classicists to read figures of transition as places of instability of norms. Butler, Gender Trouble, 1990. The classical reception of these tools tends to view Tiresias as an impossible witness who, precisely because he traverses categories, is placed by the gods to resolve a conflict. Knowledge here arises from having inhabited multiple roles. On a religious anthropological level, this condition is often described through the category of liminality, elaborated by Victor Turner, University of Chicago/Virginia, 1920 to 1983, Anthropology of Rituals, who defines liminal those who find themselves between social and identity states. In readings of ritual studies applied to Greek myth, Tiresias appears liminal for multiple reasons combined. Blindness places him between perception and non-perception. The transformation of sex places him between roles. His prophetic function places him between human and divine, and his presence in Hades places him between life and death. This overlap of liminality explains his narrative power. Tiresias can say what others cannot because he never entirely belongs to a single category.
Tragic structure and the function of the seer. Froma I. Zeitlin, Princeton University, active 1970 to present, Greek literature and tragedy theory, has made influential the idea of Thebes as a dramatic anti-polis, a mythic place favored by Athenians to stage internal otherness, family, sexuality, origin, power, and crisis of law. Thebes, theater of self and society in Athenian drama, 1986. Tiresias, as a recurring Theban seer, functions as a device of continuity within this laboratory. He is not merely a character, but a mechanism that reactivates the problem of authority when the city deludes itself into thinking it can be self-sufficient. On the level of dramatic form, Tiresias is often read as a revealer character who accelerates the catastrophe, not because he causes it, but because he forces the polis to choose between acknowledgement and rejection of the sacred. This is compatible with readings that see tragedy as a public decision-making machine. The scene of the seer is not an appendage of religion, but a theater of deliberation, where the king attempts to reduce the divine sign to a political variable. The repetition of the motive of the accusation of corruption against Tiresias signals a structural conflict between charismatic authority and institutional authority, which the tragedy makes perceivable to the Athenian public as a problem of their own democracy and religious practices. Dionysus, civic order, and the risk of rejection. Modern readings of Bacchae have frequently emphasized that Dionysus does not only represent intoxication, but a theory of the social. Recognizing him means acknowledging a portion of otherness, body, emotion, and cult that the polis cannot simply repress. Richard Seaford, University of Exeter, 1949 to 2022, Tragedy and Dionysian Religion with Attention to Economy and Ritual, has discussed Dionysus as a force that exposes the limits of political and familial order when it demands self-sufficiency. Seaford's comments and studies on Bacchae and Dionysus. Within this framework, Tiresias is the interpreter of the necessity for integration. He does not defend the irrational, but warns that denying a god produces a violent return of the repressed within the civic body.
Law of the Dead, Burial, and Civic Theology. Studies on death and funerary ritual, such as those of Robert Garland, University of Warwick, active 1880 to present, Religion and Society, Death in the Greek World, have shown that burial is a focal point between family, city, and gods. Denying funerary rites is not just punishing an enemy, but altering the relationship of the community with the chthonic order. Garland, The Greek Way of Death, 1985. In Antigone, Tiresias enters as a censor of ritual failure. His reading of the omens does not concern a technical detail, but the diagnosis that the polis has violated its practical theology by attempting to subordinate a religious obligation to a political decree. This point is often discussed also in the perspective of nomos versus physis, or human law versus unwritten laws. But the religious bibliography insists that, for a Greek, the crisis is above all one of ritual correctness and relationship with the gods, not a purely abstract ethical dispute. Tiresias thus becomes a figure who reinserts politics into the sacred, showing that sovereignty is limited. The king can command over the living, but he cannot unilaterally redefine duties towards the dead without cultural consequences.
Beyond the polis, Tiresias in Hades and post-mortem authority. In Homeric contexts, studies on the underworld and the rituals of the Nicaea have often read Tiresias as the exception that confirms the rule. The dead are normally devoid of full agency, but the seer retains the capacity for speech and intellect. This exceptional status is interpreted as a signal of his belonging to an order of knowledge that does not depend on biological vitality, but on a special relationship with the divine. In terms of religious theory, Tiresias is almost a functionary of the threshold. His authority traverses the levels of being, and this retroactively strengthens the credibility of divination even in the world of the living.
Reception and long durability. Reception studies. The modern reception of the figure of Tiresias is often treated in reception studies, a consolidated field by scholars such as Lorna Hardwick, Open University, active 1990 to present, Reception of the Classics, and Charles Martindale, University of Bristol, active 1980 to present, Theory of Latin and Classical Reception. Their methodological starting point is that ancient texts do not influence the future passively. They are recontextualized into new cultural questions. Hardwick, Reception Studies, 2003. Martindale, Foundational Works on Reception. Tiresias is particularly reusable because he concentrates themes that every era revisits: the authority of truth against power, the disabled body as a source of knowledge, and gender instability as a place of knowledge.
If this content pleased you, I invite you to like it, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next videos. Your support truly encourages me to keep creating content like this.